Welcome to Crimson Clues, where shadows hide secrets and silence reveals the truth. Every story is a puzzle, and every clue takes you closer to the answer. Subscribe now, join the hunt, and let the mystery begin. Chapter 1, The Scholar's Final Lesson. The November fog that crept over Cambridge that evening appeared to bear a weight of secrets, which I had no way of knowing at the time. I stood behind Hercule on the steps of King's College, watching him arrange his overcoat, with the same precise attention he applied to everything, big and little. "Mon ami Hastings," he whispered, his breath creating little clouds in the chilly air. "This visit to the institution has been quite satisfying. The young minds, while enthusiastic, lack method. All understanding is built on the principles of order and process." Poirot had just finished giving a guest lecture on the psychology of memory to a room full of undergraduates and dons. The response had been enthusiastic, though I must admit that much of the psychological theory was beyond my comprehension. Still, it was always a pleasure to watch my old friend in his element, displaying the workings of those renowned little grey cells to a rapt audience. We were on our approach to the porter's lodge when a young man appeared, racing through the mist, his academic gown billowing behind him like the wings of a big bird. "Mr. Poirot," he yelled out frantically. "Thank heavens I discovered you. I'm Dr. Colin Faraday from the Classics faculty. There's been, we need your knowledge." Poirot paused and looked at the young man with interest. Dr. Faraday appeared to be in his early 30s, with a pale skin and slightly bowed shoulders, characteristic of men who spend their days bent over old writings. His brown hair was tousled, and his grey eyes reflected genuine distress. "Bah, Dr. Faraday, you have the appearance of a man who has heard dreadful news. Pray, about what has happened?" "It's Professor Thistlewick, Professor Hercule Thistlewick, from Magdalen College. He has been found. Well, he appears to have died peacefully in his rooms this evening, but there are some irregularities that the master thought you might want to investigate." I noticed Poirot's eyes brighten with interest. "You claim there are irregularities? What kind of nature?" Dr. Faraday looked about anxiously, as if the walls could be listening. "Perhaps you should come and see for yourself, sir. The police have been alerted, but they appear to prefer to accept it as a natural death. The master, however, was aware of your presence at Cambridge and thought, 'May we come at once?'" Poirot was already going, his customary rapid steps taking him through the campus courtyard. "Tell me, this Professor Thistlewick, he was a man of what age?" 67, sir. A scholar of ancient ethics and moral philosophy, he was well liked by his students, despite his eccentricities. As we strolled through the short passageways that connected the several universities, Dr. Faraday taught us the fundamentals. Professor Thistlewick was discovered at 8 p.m. by college porter Jenkins while making his evening rounds. The professor was sat in his favorite armchair beside the fireplace, a book open in his lap, and appeared to have passed away while reading. Mrs. Dawes, his housekeeper, arrived quickly after being summoned. The college physician had been summoned and declared natural causes. A cardiac attack is highly likely. Then what? Is there any reason to suspect otherwise? Dr. Faraday hesitated. "It's tough to describe, Captain Hastings. Nothing that would hold up in court, you understand. But Professor Thistlewick was fine. He was a man with extremely definite tendencies. Everything had to be just right, and there were several things in the scene that appeared off. We had arrived at Magdalen College by this point, its medieval walls towering ghost-like through the gloom. The porter led us through a little courtyard to a stairway in the far corner. Professor Thistlewick's apartments were on the first level, and even before we got to his door, I could see the warm glow of lamplight flowing out. The sitting room was exactly what one would anticipate from the Cambridge dawn. The walls are lined with books. The furniture is comfy but aged, and there is a lingering fragrance of pipe tobacco and old paper. Professor Thistlewick stayed in his chair, a dignified presence even after death. He was a little neat man with white hair and a well-trimmed beard. His hands rested comfortably on an open volume of Marcus Aurelius, but it was not the late scholar who piqued Poirot's interest. Instead, my friend's gaze shifted to a tiny table near the chair, where an exquisite porcelain teacup stood on its saucer. "Voilà," Poirot whispered, bending to check the cup but not touching it. "Dear Dr. Faraday, you mentioned irregularities. This cup is chipped, isn't it?" "Yes, sir. Mrs. Dawes made special mention of it near the rim. She claimed that the professor was obsessive with his tea service, which was from the 18th century in China. He would never drink out of a damaged cup. Poe nodded slowly, his gaze taking in every feature of the room. He strolled to the fireplace, where the dying embers created dancing shadows on the walls. "And here," he said, crouching before the grate, "we have the remnants of letters, Nespa. But what kind of correspondence could be so delicate that it needed to be destroyed?" I gazed over his shoulder at the grey ash in the fireplace. Among the fragments, I could just make out a portion of what appeared to be an envelope, a corner with a foreign postmark. I saw that they appeared to be from abroad, Precisim Hastings. But from where and why burn it? A letter that is so important that it must be destroyed right away, but not so urgent that it prevents you from finishing your tea. A new voice stopped our examination. "I beg your pardon, gents, but could you tell me what you're doing here?" We turned to see a stern-faced woman in her middle years standing in the doorway. She wore a black coat and held herself with the unmistakable authority of someone used to managing both a household and the guy who lived in it. "You must be Mrs. Dawes," Poirot said politely. "I'm Hercule Poirot, and here is my friend Captain Hastings. Dr. Faraday has requested that we investigate the circumstances surrounding your employer's death." Mrs. Dawes's demeanor softened slightly, but she remained visibly shaken. "Oh, I have heard of you, Mr. Poirot. Professor Thistlewick often mentioned your cases. He was a big fan of detective stories, although he always said actual crimes were far more mundane than fiction." Poirot remarked, "That is an interesting observation. Tell me, Mrs. Dawes, when you discovered the professor this evening, was everything precisely as it is now?" Mrs. Dawes spoke hesitantly. "I may have straightened things up a little when I arrived. Do you understand how this happens automatically?" Poirot's eyebrows raised. "Have you gotten everything in order? How will this be accomplished?" Mrs. Dawes appeared uncomfortable. "Nothing significant, sir. Just tidying up." Poirot pressed the teacup, for example, lightly. "Was it in this same location when you arrived?" I believe it may have been on the floor. It was quite natural for the unfortunate gentleman to make a sudden turn. I just put it back where it belonged, and the window was open when you arrived." "Perhaps slightly, sir, but I cannot be positive." Everything was quite disturbing. Poirot absorbed this information carefully before moving to the window in question. It looked out onto a small courtyard where a bicycle was resting against the wall below, clearly visible even in the dark light. Tia and Poirot mumbled, "And whose bicycle is that?" Mrs. Dawes joined him beside the window. "Oh, that is Dr. Faraday's machine, sir. I'm not sure what it's doing there. He normally keeps it in the college's bike shed." I looked at Dr. Faraday, who had been standing silently by the door. His face was surprised and, if I'm not incorrect, slightly alarmed. "My bicycle, but I left it in its customary location this morning. I can't comprehend how it got there." Poe leaned forward, examining the bicycle more closely. "The wheels are muddy." "Are they not?" "However, the streets of Cambridge have been dry for the past 2 days." Dr. Faraday shuffled uncomfortably. "There is a river walkway. Perhaps someone borrowed it to ride along the Cam." "Peut-être," Poirot responded, though his tone indicated that he felt this explanation inadequate. As I lay in my bed that night, listening to the Cambridge bells chime the hours, I couldn't shake the sensation that we'd gotten into something far more complicated than a simple case of academic tragedy. The fog outside seemed to whisper of mysteries still to be revealed, and I wondered what further surprises the morning might hold. Chapter 2. The Poet and the Paradox. The next morning was brilliant and sunny, with the fog removed to reveal Cambridge in all its old grandeur. Poirot and I went to Magdalen College after breakfast, where we had scheduled a meeting with the master to discuss the previous evening's occurrences. Dr. Theodore Whitmore, Magdalen's master, was a fine gentleman in his 70s, with the controlled tone and serious demeanor one would expect from a lifelong professor. He welcomed us into his private study, a book-lined chamber that spoke of decades of scholastic studies. "Gentlemen," he began, settling behind his desk, "I must admit I am deeply troubled by this business. Professor Thistlewick was not just a co-worker, but also a close friend. We studied together as undergraduates about 50 years ago." "You must have known him well," Poirot noticed. "Tell me, Master, have you noticed any changes in the professor's behavior lately?" Dr. Whitmore pondered the question carefully. "Now that you bring it up, yeah. Archie had become fairly reclusive over the past few months. He had always been dedicated to his profession, but lately he was almost fanatical about something, and there was a tightness about him that was completely unlike his usual calm demeanor. Did he tell you about the nature of his present research? That's it. He did not. Quite odd for Archie. In the past, he was always ready to share his latest discoveries and views regarding old ethical systems, but recently when I inquired about his work, he would shift the subject or provide vague, evasive responses. Poirot leaned forward with interest. What can you tell us about Miss Trent, who visited him yesterday? Oh yes, Miss Marian Trent. She is a visiting Oxford Fellow, a poet and a literary critic. Her art is actually rather excellent, despite its unorthodox nature. She and Professor Thistlewick had built a connection over their shared interest in the intersection of literature and philosophy. I would very much like to speak with Miss Trent, Poirot remarked. Do you know where she could be found? She has rooms in the guest house. I can send a message if you like. While we waited for Miss Trent, Poirot requested to inspect Professor Thistlewick's office, which was located in a different building across the college grounds. Dr. Whitmore escorted us through several courtyards to a small brick structure that housed the classics faculty. Professor Thistlewick's office was similar to his private quarters, crammed with books, papers, and the accumulated litter of a scholarly life. But here the atmosphere was different. Whereas his private study had been peaceful and almost contemplative, his office exuded a sense of urgency, as work remained unfinished. Regarde, Poirot remarked, pointing to the professor's desk. Consider how the papers are arranged, or rather disarranged. This is not the desk of a man who has finished his day's work and returned home for tea. Indeed, the desk was cluttered with loose notes, open books, and what appeared to be draft letters. Several sheets of paper were crumpled and tossed, missing the wastebasket and laying on the floor. I noticed that he was composing something that required several efforts. Poirot grabbed one of the crumpled papers and smoothed it out. We received a letter, but it was not in English. This is in French. To look at the bottom, it's signed Felix Turner. Felix Turner and Dr. Whitmore exchanged perplexed looks. I've never heard Archie reference someone with that name. Perhaps, Poirot suggested carefully, Felix Turner is a pseudonym, not a real person. See here. He indicated numerous other draft pages, all signed with the same name, all in French and all claiming to be scholarly articles or essays. I looked at the papers more closely. Professor Thistlewick's handwriting was unmistakable, but the content was uncommon, harsh and critical, appearing to target many areas of academic practice and scholarship. These appear to be severe criticisms, I said. Accusations of plagiarism, fabricated research and academic dishonesty. This isn't what one would anticipate from Professor Thistlewick. On the contrary, Captain Hastings, Dr. Whitmore said slowly, these are exactly the sort of things Archie would care deeply about. He was above all else a man of rigid moral principles. If he had discovered academic misconduct, it would have disturbed him greatly. It was at this moment that a soft knock came at the door, and Miss Marian Trent was announced. Miss Trent was a woman of perhaps 35, with striking auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She was dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, and her manner was composed despite the obvious strain of recent events. Dr. Whitmore, she said, I came as soon as I received your message, though I must say I'm not certain how I can help with what happened to Archie. Poirot rose courteously. Miss Trent, I am Hercule Poirot, and this is my colleague, Captain Hastings. We are investigating the circumstances surrounding Professor Thistlewick's death. Miss Trent's composure flickered slightly. Investigating, but surely it was natural causes. The poor dear man, simply his heart gave out. Perhaps, Poirot replied gently, but there are certain aspects of the case that puzzle me. I understand you visited the professor yesterday afternoon. Yes, I did. We had arranged to discuss a paper I'm presenting next month on the moral philosophy of the Romantic poets. Miss Trent's voice was steady, but I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. And how did you find the professor? In good health, good spirits. Miss Trent hesitated. He seemed troubled about something, distracted, not at all his usual self. Mrs. Dawes mentioned that there were raised voices during your visit. Might I ask what caused this disagreement? For a moment, Miss Trent said nothing, her eyes moving from Poirot to Dr. Whitmore and back again. Finally, she seemed to reach some internal decision. Very well, but what I'm about to tell you must be held in the strictest confidence, at least until you understand its full implications. She moved to the window, gazing out at the college grounds as if gathering her thoughts. Professor Thistlewick was not merely a scholar of ancient ethics. He was a practitioner of modern ethical journalism. For the past 2 years, he had been writing exposé articles under the pseudonym Felix Turner, revealing corruption and misconduct in academic institutions across Europe. The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. Poirot breathed. And these articles, they were published where? In various academic journals on the continent and in some political periodicals. Archie was fluent in several languages, and he felt that publishing abroad would provide some protection from retaliation. Retaliation. Dr. Whitmore looked shocked. But surely academic misconduct, when properly exposed, is simply a matter for institutional discipline. Miss Trent turned back to face us, her expression grave. You would think so, wouldn't you? But Archie's investigations had uncovered some rather serious matters. Falsified archaeological data that had influenced government policy, plagiarized research that had resulted in significant grant funding, even one case where a professor had been selling advanced copies of examination papers to wealthy students. And your role in this enterprise? Poe inquired. I assisted him in researching and preparing the articles. My literary experience helped me adopt the appropriate tone and language. And as an Oxford guest, I was free to roam between institutions without suspicion. But, as Poirot pointed out, you had some disagreements yesterday. Miss Trent's serenity eventually broke, and tears streamed down her cheeks. Archie discovered something really nasty about someone at Cambridge. He was drafting what he called his final piece, which he claimed would uncover the most terrible academic fraud of our generation, and you objected to its publishing. I asked him not to publish it. The evidence was circumstantial, and the article's target was a person with significant influence. I was concerned about Archie's safety and told him so. Dr. Whitmore leaned forward in his chair. Miss Trent, surely you don't mean to suggest that Professor Thistlewick's death was connected to these journalistic activities? I don't know what to think, Miss Trent replied, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. All I know is that Archie was afraid. He claimed he had received threatening letters and warnings to stop his research, and when I arrived for our meeting yesterday, he was in near panic. Poirot processed this information with his usual silence. The discovery of Professor Thistlewick's secret life as an intellectual crusader shed a completely new perspective on his death. What had appeared to be the tranquil death of an elderly professor was becoming increasingly sinister. As we prepared to delve deeper into the professor's hidden world, I couldn't help but wonder how many more mysteries were beneath the gentle surface of Cambridge academic life. Chapter 3. Berzer's Novels. That afternoon, Poirot insisted on paying a visit to Mr. Pembember, the college Berzer. I must admit that this decision perplexed me, because the financial officer appeared to be the least likely of our suspects in Professor Thistlewick's killing. However, years of experience had taught me to trust my friend's intuition, even when his logic was not immediately clear. We located Mr. Pember in his office in the college's administrative building, a somewhat austere space filled with ledgers, filing cabinets, and the general air of painstaking record-keeping. The man appeared even more uneasy than the previous evening, continuously adjusting his spectacles and shifting papers on his desk. "Mr. Poirot," he said when he saw us, "what a surprise. I do hope you're making progress with this dreadful business. The whole college is quite unsettled, you know. Poor Professor Thistlewick. Such a shock." "Indeed," Poirot replied smoothly. "Which is why I hoped you might assist us with some details regarding the professor's financial affairs. Thistlewick limited his blackmail actions to foreign academics. Not at all. I believe he was preparing to target closer targets, those in Cambridge, who were more vulnerable to his threats. People such as yourself, possibly." Dr. Faraday's composure slipped somewhat. "Yes, Mr. Poirot, like me, the room fell silent, but for the ticking of the mantelpiece clock and the odd crackle from the fireplace. The weight of this news weighed heavy in the air, altering our perception of the kind scholar who died in this chamber. Tell me, Dr. Faraday, what Professor Thistlewick thought he had found about your academic background." He had managed to obtain copies of my early research publications and was comparing them to similar work published in German journals. He was certain that I plagiarized my doctoral thesis. "And did you?" Dr. Faraday's shoulders dropped as if a heavy weight had fallen on them. Yes, Mr. Poirot, I had. I was young, trying to advance my career, and the German work was so obscure that I assumed it would never be discovered. So when Professor Thistlewick faced you with this information, he demanded $500 for his silence and threatened to destroy my career if I didn't pay, just as I appeared to have damaged his sons, Poirot replied quietly. So you knew about James Thistlewick. The professor made sure I knew. He told me in great detail about his son's death, how the guilt of the fake plagiarism claims drove the young man to suicide. He claimed that justice required that I face the same fate. I felt a shiver run down my spine as the full ramifications of Dr. Faraday's comments became clear. So you killed him to prevent this exposure? No, Dr. Faraday screamed, his voice echoing against the book-lined walls. That's it. I did not kill him. When I came for our interview yesterday evening, Professor Thistlewick had already died. Leaned forward with keen interest. Already dead? So why didn't you call for aid immediately? I panicked. I realized that if his death was investigated, his blackmail actions would be revealed and I would be ruined whatever. So I attempted to make it appear that he died quietly from natural causes. By accomplishing what exactly? I altered the scene somewhat. The professor was presumably attacked while standing near the window. I discovered him crumpled on the floor. I shifted him into his chair and attempted to make it appear that he had died while reading, but I'm sorry I'm not very adept at such deceptions. Pooh observed the chipped teacup and the displaced bicycle. Yes, I had left my bicycle beneath his window, as I frequently do while visiting faculty members in that building, but in my panic, I forgot to move it. And the teacup, well, I'm afraid I dropped it when cleaning up. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his fingers steepled in his signature concentration position. Dr. Faraday's story is reasonable, yet it raises an apparent question. If you didn't kill Professor Thistlewick, who did? I'm not sure, Mr. Poirot, but I believe it was one of his other victims. At the time, the man had created a lot of enemies through his blackmail activities. There was a faint knock on the door. Dr. Faraday appeared astonished, but Poirot seemed to have expected it. Poirot called for an entree. Miss Marian Trent emerged from behind the door, clad in a dark coat and visibly concerned. Her typically calm manner had given way to apparent anguish. Her hands clasped a little leather portfolio, as if it held something crucial. "Dr. Faraday," she exclaimed breathlessly, "thank heavens I discovered you. I need to meet with you quickly about—" She paused abruptly when she observed Poirot and me. "Oh, Mr. Poirot, I hadn't realized you were here." Poirot greeted Miss Trent politely. "How fortunate. Dr. Faraday was just expressing to us his theory that Professor Thistlewick was a blackmailer. Could you put some light on this allegation?" Miss Trent's face turned pale, and the portfolio slid from her unsteady fingers, scattering papers on the carpet. As we all moved to assist collect the scattered documents, I noticed what appeared to be correspondence in Professor Thistlewick's familiar handwriting. The discovery of the professor's alleged blackmail activities had clearly shook her to her core, and I was curious what further secrets this odd case would expose before we reached its end. Chapter 5, The Confession. Miss Trent's cheeks paled as she looked at the scattered papers on the carpet. Blackmail, but that is impossible. Archie was fighting corruption, not partaking in it. "Pettit," Poirot answered, kneeling to assist in gathering the documents, but Dr. Faraday has showed us correspondence indicating otherwise. As we collected the papers from Miss Trent's portfolio, I noted that they were in Professor Thistlewick's handwriting, including letter drafts, notes, and what appeared to be fragments of a larger document. Miss Trent watched with mounting worry as Poirot scrutinized each sheet with his careful attention to detail. "These can't be genuine," she replied finally. "The handwriting is Archie's, but the content, this isn't the man I knew." Nevertheless, Dr. Faraday stated, "they are genuine. Professor Thistlewick was not the noble crusader he claimed to be." Miss Trent shook her head vehemently. "No, there is something wrong here. Archie would never." She paused abruptly, her eyes expanding as if she had just realized something significant. Among the strewn documents, one stood out to her, a folded sheet that looked different than the rest. "Mr. Poirot," she began quickly, "there's something I need to tell you. This afternoon I discovered something that will change everything." But before she could continue, the lights in the room went out, leaving us in full darkness. In the pandemonium that ensued, I heard rushing footsteps, a woman's scream of concern, and what seemed like a heavy object tumbling to the ground. When the lights were restored a few moments later, it appeared that someone had tampered with the gas line. We discovered Miss Trent unconscious on the carpet near the fireplace. Dr. Faraday was nowhere to be found, and the envelope containing supposed blackmail letters had disappeared. Miss Trent regained consciousness after a few minutes, but she was scared and puzzled about what had happened during those brief seconds of darkness. "Did you see who attacked you?" I questioned as I guided her into a chair. No, everything occurred so quickly. Someone grabbed me from behind, and then I received a punch to the head. Nothing happened till I awoke just now. Poirot had been attentively inspecting the room throughout this interaction. Dr. Faraday looks to have left hastily, but he has left something behind. He pointed to a little object on the floor near where Miss Trent had fallen, a leather pocketbook that was obviously dropped during the battle. Miss Trent confirmed that this belonged to Dr. Faraday. I've seen him carry it numerous times. Poirot opened the wallet and scrutinized the contents with his usual thoroughness. Most interestingly, we have a receipt from a Brussels pharmacist from 3 days earlier. And this? He held up a tiny glass vial. This appears to be some type of drug. I studied the vial more closely. The label is in French, but it appears to be some form of heart medication, Précise Hastings. And if I'm not mistaken, this vial contains a drug intended to mimic Professor Thistlewick's legitimate heart medication, but with entirely different results. Miss Trent appeared puzzled. "But why would Dr. Faraday own such a thing?" Pooh responded, "That is an excellent question. Perhaps because he found it in the professor's quarters and, realizing its significance, took it with him when he left so quickly." Miss Trent, who had recovered her calm despite the bandage on her head, delved into her coat pocket and pulled out a thin folder that had somehow survived the evening's pandemonium. After our talk this morning, I decided to look into Archie's study more closely. I went to his office and discovered this stashed in another of his secret compartments. She handed the packet to Poirot, who opened it and began reading with great enthusiasm. As he read the document, his countenance became more serious. "Mayor," he said after a few moments, "this is not what I was expecting at all." "What is it?" I asked impatiently. "It looks to be a thorough confession written by Professor Thistlewick. Listen to this. I can no longer bear the consequences of what I've done. My thirst for justice for my kid has corrupted me beyond redemption. I have become the precise thing I intended to destroy, a person who utilizes knowledge as a weapon against the innocent." Miss Trent nodded regretfully. "There is more. Read the section about Dr. Faraday." Poirot resumed reading aloud. "Young Faraday's plagiarism was true, but it was not the deliberate steal I portrayed it to be. He was a struggling student who made a desperate mistake, and he has spent years making up through serious scholarship and teaching. My son's death was awful, but Faraday was not to blame. The bogus accusations against James originated from a different source entirely." "Good Lord," I exclaimed. "You mentioned yesterday that he had been drawing rather heavily on his research accounts." Mr. Pembember's face flushed slightly. "Well, yes, though I want to make it perfectly clear that there was nothing improper about the expenditures. The professor had every right to use his discretionary funds as he saw fit." "Naturalmente. But the nature of these expenditures, they were unusual, quite unusual actually. Large amounts for international postage, payments to foreign research services, subscriptions to continental publications, not at all the sort of expenses one would expect from a scholar of ancient philosophy." Poirot leaned forward with interest. "Research services of what nature?" Mr. Pember consulted a thick ledger on his desk. "Well, there were payments to something called Brussels Investigation Services, several large sums to various European libraries for document reproduction, and regular payments to what appears to be a translation service in Paris." "How large were these payments, if you don't mind my asking?" "Over the past 18 months, nearly $800, quite substantial for a professor's discretionary account." I whistled softly at the figure. $800 represented a considerable sum, far more than most academics would spend on routine research. And Professor Thistlewick offered no explanation for these expenditures. "That's what was so puzzling," Mr. Pember replied, removing his spectacles to clean them nervously. "Archie had always been scrupulously careful about documentation. Every expense properly receipted and explained, but these recent charges, He would simply submit the bills with a note saying research expenses and nothing more. Did this concern you sufficiently to make official inquiries? Well, I did speak to the master about it. Dr. Whitmore assured me that if Professor Thistlewick said the expenses were legitimate, then they were. But from a bookkeeping standpoint, it was most irregular. Poirot absorbed this information thoughtfully. Tell me, Mr. Pember, in your capacity as bursar, you must have knowledge of all the college's financial affairs. Are you aware of any other faculty members who might have been engaging in unusual expenditures? Mr. Pember's flush deepened. I'm not certain I should discuss other faculty members' private financial matters. Kemoki, I understand your discretion, but surely if there were irregularities that might bear upon Professor Thistlewick's death. Well, Mr. Pember said reluctantly, there was one matter that had been troubling me. Dr. Faraday, he's been living rather beyond his means lately. New bicycle, expensive clothing, frequent trips to London. His salary, while respectable, wouldn't normally support such expenditures. Has Dr. Faraday offered any explanation for this improved financial situation? He mentioned something about a family inheritance, but when I asked for documentation for our records, purely routine, you understand, he became quite evasive. Poirot and I exchanged glances. Another piece of the puzzle was falling into place. One more question, if I may. Yesterday evening, when you visited Professor Thistlewick, did he seem to be expecting someone else? Now that you mention it, yes. He kept checking his pocket watch and glancing toward the window. When I asked if he was expecting a visitor, he said he had an important appointment later in the evening. Did he give any indication of the nature of this appointment? Mr. Pember shook his head, only that it concerned a matter of justice that had been too long delayed. As we left the bursar's office, I found myself increasingly troubled by the picture that was emerging. Poe, I said, it seems clear that Dr. Faraday had both motive and opportunity. He knew he was about to be exposed. He had access to the professor's rooms, and he was apparently in some financial difficulty that might have been resolved by stopping the investigation. Oui, mon ami, the case against Dr. Faraday appears compelling, but there are still aspects of this affair that trouble me, such as the timing. Hastings. If Professor Thistlewick was expecting an important visitor yesterday evening, and if that visitor was Dr. Faraday, then why was the professor drinking tea from a chipped cup? A man of his fidious nature would never serve an important guest with damaged china. Perhaps the chip occurred during their confrontation. Potre, but remember the fragment I found beneath his chair. It was a fresh break, not the old chip that Mrs. Dawes noticed. This suggests the cup was damaged after the professor's death, not before. I pondered this as we walked back toward our lodgings. The November afternoon was growing dark, and the gas lamps were beginning to flicker to life along the narrow streets. There's something else that bothers me, I said. If Dr. Faraday is our murderer, why did he want us to investigate? Surely he would have been better served if his death had been ruled natural. Hastings made an excellent point. Unless Dr. Faraday believed that by appearing to help with the investigation, he might better control its direction. We had just entered our inn when a young college servant approached us with a message. I beg your pardon, gentlemen, but Dr. Faraday has ordered me to send this to Mr. Poirot right away. Poirot opened the note and swiftly read it, his countenance becoming grim. What is it? I asked. Dr. Faraday requests an immediate meeting. He claims to have found new proof on Professor Thistlewick's death. We will be very surprised by the evidence he claims. Where does he want to meet Professor Thistlewick's chambers? At 8 how this evening. I experienced a coldness that had nothing to do with the November air. Poe, this must be a trap. If Dr. Faraday is the murderer, why would we put ourselves at his mercy? Because, as Monger Hastings points out, sometimes taking risks is necessary to discover the truth. But we will not go unprepared. Poirot instantly drafted his own note and gave it to the college servant. Please bring this to Dr. Whitmore ASAP. Inform him that this is an urgent problem. As the servant ran away, Poirot gave me a comforting look. Don't be concerned, my friend. By 8 p.m. today, Dr. Whitmore and numerous college officials will have gotten precise instructions on what to do if we do not leave Professor Thistlewick's chambers within an hour of our appointment. The shadows lengthened as we braced for what could be a dangerous clash. Whatever Dr. Faraday had discovered, or claimed to have discovered, would eventually be exposed. As I watched Poirot make his meticulous preparations, I couldn't help but worry if we were walking into a perfectly planned trap. or if the young lecturer indeed possessed the key to solving Professor Thistlewick's death. Chapter 4. The Hidden Truth. We made our way through the shadowy college grounds to Professor Thistlewick's staircase exactly 5 minutes before 8 p.m. The night was chilly and clear, with a brisk wind rattling the naked branches of the ancient trees that dotted the courtyards. Our footsteps reverberated off the cobblestones, providing an almost ethereal accompaniment to our voyage. Dr. Faraday was waiting for us at the building's door, his face pallid but determined under the lamplight. He appeared to have aged significantly since our initial meeting, with dark bags under his eyes and a nervous stiffness in his motions that suggested sleepless nights and increasing anxiousness. Mr. Poirot and Captain Hastings, thank you for attending. I understand that this may appear unusual, but I believed it was necessary that we meet privately. Sir Mo responded politely. You mentioned new evidence. Yes, but it is somewhat difficult. Perhaps we should go upstairs and converse more comfortably. As we climbed the tiny staircase to Professor Thistlewick's quarters, I couldn't shake the sensation that we were going into a meticulously planned trap. But Poirot appeared completely at ease, even pausing to scrutinize a portrait of a long-dead college student hanging on the landing. Dr. Faraday unlocked the door to the professor's sitting room and led us inside. The room had been cleaned since our last visit, but it still had the sorrowful feel of a life abruptly ended. The lamplight created dancing shadows over the book-lined walls, and the air smelled faintly of old paper and tobacco. Now then, Dr. Faraday began, closing the door behind us, I suppose you're wondering why I asked you here. Poirot answered, reclining into the chair opposite the one where Professor Thistlewick died. You talked about evidence. Dr. Faraday strolled to the fireplace and stood with his back to the dwindling embers. In the lamplight, his face appeared weary as if he hadn't slept in several nights. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into the jacket pocket. Mr. Poe, I'm about to tell you something that may shock you. Professor Thistlewick was not the innocent victim that he seemed to be. For the past 2 years, Mr. Poirot has been deliberately destroying the careers and reputations of many professors, not out of a lofty desire for justice, but out of personal vendetta and financial gain. Poirot's eyebrows raised slightly, but his voice remained steady. Dr. Faraday, these are serious accusations. Do you have evidence to back them up? I do indeed. Dr. Faraday reached into his jacket and took out a hefty packet. These are copies of letters between Professor Thistlewick and some of his victims. Letters asking payment in exchange for silence on alleged academic dishonesty. He passed the letter to Poirot, who carefully read the contents. The papers rustled softly in the quiet room as my friend examined each document with his usual thoroughness. After a few minutes, he looked up with serious interest. Most illuminating, Dr. Faraday. But I've noticed that all of these letters are directed to institutions and persons on the continent. Are you implying that Professor Thistlewick recognized that Dr. Faraday was not responsible for his son's death? It appears so. But there's more. Poirot turned the pages. I've been blackmailing innocent individuals, exploiting their little transgressions to fund my investigations into more serious crimes. I convinced myself I was serving justice, but I was really serving my own thirst for vengeance. I can no longer live with this information. The room grew silent as we thought about the consequences of this news. The kind scholar we thought we were looking into had certainly led a double life, but one far more convoluted and terrible than we had anticipated. The professor's death, I explained, was suicide, Miss Trent concluded calmly. That is what I noticed this afternoon. Archie had planned to commit suicide because he felt guilty about who he had become. But Poirot was shaking his head slowly. No, Miss Trent, I don't believe Professor Thistlewick committed suicide, but the confession is sincere. We do, however, observe the date. It was written 3 weeks ago, not yesterday, and there is another issue that has me quite concerned. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and took out the small piece of porcelain he had found beneath Professor Thistlewick's chair that first evening. This piece of china indicates that the teacup was shattered following the professor's death, not before. Someone went to his room yesterday evening, discovered he was already dead, and then attempted to stage the scene to appear as if it had happened naturally. Miss Trent looked perplexed. But if Dr. Faraday discovered him already dead, and the professor did not commit suicide, who did? Poirot's emerald eyes had that special shine that showed his small grey cells were working at full power. The jigsaw pieces were finally starting to fall into place, and I had a feeling we were getting close to solving this most intricate of mysteries. Chapter 6: The Final Revelation. The next morning, Poirot insisted that we collect all of the main characters in this strange drama for what he called a final confirmation of facts. Dr. Whitmore had arranged for us to utilize the college's medieval dining hall, a magnificent space with soaring Gothic arches and portraits of prominent graduates peering down from the paned walls. By 10 takes, we had recruited the remainder of our ensemble of characters. Miss Trent sat at the long oak table, still pale from the previous evening's trauma, resolved to see the matter through to completion. Mr. Pember sat in a chair near the windows, his ledgers and papers spread out before him with characteristic precision. Mrs. Dawes had been summoned from her chores and sat silently, hands folded on her lap, the epitome of patient regard. Dr. Faraday was noticeably absent, having departed totally following the previous evening's argument. A search of his rooms found that he had packed quickly and left Cambridge during that night. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began by standing at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back. "We have convened here to solve the riddle of Professor Archibald Thistlewick's death. What appeared to be a simple case of natural causes has turned out to be far more complex. A story of deception, guilt, and eventually justice delayed but not denied." Dr. Whitmore leant forward with interest. "You mean to suggest that Professor Thistlewick was murdered?" "May we, Master, but not in the way we first suspected, and not from the person we thought was responsible." He began to pace slowly around the table, his green eyes scanning each face in turn. "Let me first explain how I discovered the truth." He lingered near the towering windows, where the morning light created long shadows on the ancient stone floor. The professor's financial records revealed payments to Brussels investigating services. When I looked into what they had found for him, I discovered they were studying the closure of the Beacon School for Boys in 1924, where his son James had attended. Margaret Dawson perpetrated the embezzlement that wrecked the school, and then left with the money. Poirot fixed his gaze on Mrs. Dawes. Margaret Dawson. Mrs. Dawes simply flipped the names, create a new identity, forge references, and start over. The professor had established this connection, and last evening he planned to confront the woman who had eventually destroyed his son. Professor Thistlewick was expecting a visitor that evening, with whom he planned to address an important topic. But this visitor was not Dr. Faraday as we had imagined. No, the professor's visit was with someone considerably closer to home, someone who had been monitoring his actions with increasing concern. Miss Trent appeared puzzled. But who? Archie never said that he expected anyone else. "Oh, but he did, Miss Trent. Remember Mr. Pembember's testimony? The lecturer discussed a subject of justice that had been too long delayed. He was about to face Mrs. Dawes about her misdeeds, using the evidence he had obtained during his investigation." Poirot walked to stand behind Mrs. Dawes's chair. "Mrs. Dawes, you've been extremely patient with our questioning, but I think the time has come for complete honesty. Did you know about Professor Thistlewick's activities as Felix Turner?" The housekeeper's poise remained unshaken, although there was a hint of fatigue in her eyes now. "I observed that the instructor was typing." "Yes, but I minded my own business, as a proper housekeeper should. And you also knew that his investigations had led him to discover something about your own past, something that could destroy the comfortable life you had built for yourself here at the college." Mrs. Dawes' hands stiffened slightly in her lap, but her voice remained calm. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're implying, Mr. Poirot. Then let me be more direct. Professor Thistlewick learned that you were more than just a devoted maid. You had a criminal record, having embezzled monies from your previous employer and fled to Cambridge to begin a new life." Mr. Pember appeared shocked. "Mrs. Dawes, but this is impossible." Her references were impeccable. Prissy stated that they were forgeries made with great expertise and attention to detail. Mrs. Dawes, assuming that is her genuine name, has used a fictitious identity to avoid prosecution for her earlier crimes. Mrs. Dawes eventually spoke, her voice still calm, but with an underlying sharpness that had not been there before. "Even if what you say is accurate, Mr. Poirot, it would hardly be grounds for murder. Under normal circumstances, possibly not. But Professor Thistlewick had found something else. Your embezzlement was more than just theft. It contributed to the financial destruction of a modest school for disadvantaged youngsters. Your actions had a negative impact on several young people's lives. The room became silent, save for the ticking of an ancient clock on the mantelpiece. Mrs. Dawes sat quite motionless, but I noticed her knuckles had turned white where she held her hands together. Furthermore, Poirot said, "The professor had discovered that one of the children affected by your theft was a young man named James Thistlewick, his own son, who had been forced to leave his studies when the Beacon School closed. James failed academically, since he lacked the necessary education and qualifications supplied by the institution. This left him exposed to bogus claims of plagiarism, which eventually led him to death." Miss Trent gasped. "Do you mean Mrs. Dawes was responsible for the events that led to James's death?" "Indeed, if the institution had not closed owing to her fraud, James would have obtained a decent education and credentials that could have shielded him from future academic persecution. Mrs. Dawes' crime set the stage for James's final destruction." "But how?" I asked how the murder was carried out. Poirot dug into his waistcoat pocket and pulled out the small glass vial we had discovered in Dr. Faraday's lost wallet. Mrs. Dawes now had access to Professor Thistlewick's cardiac medicine. She made his tea every evening and would have known exactly which bottle held his medications. She substituted his legitimate medication with this poison, which would result in a fatal heart attack. "But why did Dr. Faraday have the vial in his possession?" Dr. Whitmore asked. "Because Master Mrs. Dawes committed a critical error. She left an empty vial of fake medication in the professor's rooms as proof of her crime. When Dr. Faraday arrived to find the professor dead, he spotted this vial among the pharmaceutical bottles. Recognizing its significance and dreading being blamed, he carried it with him as he fled." Mrs. Dawes eventually looked up, her eyes steely and calculating. "Mr. Poirot, you're incredibly intelligent, but can you prove any of this?" "May we? You see, you committed multiple serious faults. First, you forget that Professor Thistlewick was obsessed with his China service. He would never have used a chipped cup at an important meeting. In your haste to remove proof of your existence, you dropped the cup, causing harm. He moved to stand right in front of her chair. Second, when you knew the professor had died, you attempted to burn the evidence, notably the envelope holding your most recent blackmail payment to him, but you failed to totally destroy it, leaving the Brussels postmark visible. Your connection to Brussels, where you had fled following your embezzlement years before, made this especially damaging proof. Third, in your panic following the murder, you borrowed Dr. Faraday's bicycle to rapidly dispose of additional evidence along the Riverwalk, which was muddy despite the dry streets. You returned it outside the professor's window, not expecting it to be spotted. Fourth, he concluded, you inadvertently abandoned the empty bottle containing the fraudulent medication, which you had obtained from your criminal contacts in Brussels, where you had fled years before. Dr. Faraday discovered it in the professor's quarters and, fearing he would be implicated, took it with him when he fled, unaware that he was saving the most important piece of evidence against you. Mrs. Dawes arose slowly, her mask of respectability eventually sliding away. Professor Thistlewick was a foolish old man who should have kept his own business. I made a good life here and harmed no one. He had no right to damage it. Perhaps, Poirot responded calmly, but he was perfectly entitled to seek justice for his son. As the college officials apprehended Mrs. Dawes, I found myself thinking about the awful irony of the situation. Professor Thistlewick's quest for justice had resulted in his death, but not in the way any of us had anticipated. Poirot repeatedly commented that the truth was stranger and more complex than any fiction could conjure up. Epilogue: Justice and Redemption. 3 weeks later, Poirot and I found ourselves back in the comfortable sitting room of our London flat. The Cambridge affair resolved to the satisfaction of all parties involved, with the exception of the unfortunate Mrs. Dawes, who now awaited trial for Professor Thistlewick's murder. The Morning Post had delivered a letter from Dr. Whitmore informing us about the various outcomes of our investigation. I was reading parts of it aloud to Poirot, who sat in his favorite chair, painstakingly arranging a tiny collection of books with the same precision that marked all of his activities. The master reports that Dr. Faraday has returned to Cambridge. I said that he returned on his own when news of Mrs. Dawes' arrest became public. He has tendered his resignation from the college, but Dr. Whitmore appears to be unwilling to accept it. Traber, Poirot mumbled, fixing the spine of a volume to perfectly line with its neighbors. Dr. Faraday is a guy who committed a juvenile wrong, but has spent many years seeking to make up via honest scholarship. He deserves to continue his work. The master also announces Miss Trent's appointment to complete Professor Thistlewick's studies on ancient ethics. She intends to publish his respectable scholarly work while keeping his other activities covert. Poirot nodded in approval. Miss Trent has both the academic qualifications and the moral fortitude required for such a difficult undertaking. Professor Thistlewick's legacy should be his scholarship, not his involvement in vigilantism. I put the letter aside and grabbed for my teacup, pausing to carefully inspect it, a habit I had cultivated since our Cambridge excursion. Poirot, there is one aspect of this case that continues to baffle me. Mrs. Dawes seemed like a respectable, loyal housekeeper. How did you first suspect her involvement? Poirot paused his book arrangement and stared at me with those sharp green eyes. It was a teacup, mon ami. That chipped cup bothered me right away. Professor Thistlewick was a guy of rigorous habits who was obsessed with his possessions. Mrs. Dawes herself stated that he would never drink from damaged china. But we assumed the chip was ancient damage. Yes, Nell. Hastings. Remember the fragment I discovered beneath his chair? It was a new break, not the old chip that Mrs. Dawes indicated. This told me that the cup was fallen after the professor died, not before. I nodded slowly. And since Dr. Faraday claimed to have discovered the professor already dead. Exactly. Someone else had visited those rooms between the time of death and Dr. Faraday's arrival. Someone with access, who would not raise suspicion, and had a motivation to want Professor Thistlewick dead. The dirty bicycle provided another clue. Mrs. Dawes had used it to dispose of evidence along the river trail before carelessly leaving it where Dr. Faraday would be held accountable for its presence. Wasn't the Brussels connection another clue? Pricemo. Mrs. Dawes was evasive about the professor's activities, but her defensiveness suggested she knew more than she admitted. A truly naive cleaner would have been more open about her boss's strange habits. Her reticence to share specifics indicated personal involvement. Poirot rose and strolled to the window, looking out at the bustling London street below. What confirmed my assumptions was her demeanor during our interviews. She was too controlled, too careful with her comments, and when questioned about the professor's work, she pretended to mind her own business. However, she had evidently been closely monitoring his movements, and the motive, the connection to Professor Thistlewick's son, was exposed by the professor's own investigation. The Brussels investigation services he had engaged furnished me with the entire file on the Beacon School case. According to the archives, James Thistlewick was a scholarship student when the institution failed as a result of embezzlement by its bursar, Margaret Dawson, who vanished with the school's endowment. Margaret Dawson, Mrs. Dawes, had simply reversed her names and gone to Cambridge with fake references and a new identity. For years she lived quietly, avoiding detection. However, Professor Thistlewick's investigation into his son's past eventually led him to uncover the truth about what had truly destroyed the boy's future. The Brussels connection worked both ways. He was conducting an investigation while she still had contacts from her criminal history. I shook my head in wonderment. So the professor's search for justice for his son eventually led him to the lady whose crime had placed James on a path to doom. Indeed, faced with exposure and ruin, Mrs. Dawes chose murder over confession. She believed that by killing Professor Thistlewick, she could keep her secret and live a comfortable life. But she hadn't anticipated Dr. Faraday's distress, making the death appear suspicious. Nor does Hercule Poirot's presence guarantee that the inconsistencies will be noticed. Poirot finished with a faint smile. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, reflecting on the strange twists of fate that had brought all of these characters together in Cambridge. I finally spoke again. Isn't the entire situation really sad? Professor Thistlewick's noble intentions are tainted by grief and vengeance. Dr. Faraday's career was almost destroyed by an old mistake. Mrs. Dawes has been living a lie for many years. Chere Hastings. However, the story also includes a message of redemption. Dr. Faraday has discovered that honesty, while painful, is preferable to deception. Miss Trent will ensure that Professor Thistlewick's legitimate work continues to benefit scholarship, and Mrs. Dawes will finally be held accountable for her crimes. Poirot returned to his chair and picked up another book, examining its binding with characteristic attention to detail. The case reminds us that the past, however well buried, has a way of surfacing. Professor Thistlewick thought he was pursuing justice, but he was merely serving his own desire for revenge. Mrs. Dawes believed she could escape the consequences of her actions by creating a new identity. Both discovered that truth like murder will out. "And what of justice?" I asked. "Has it truly been served?" Poe considered this question carefully before answering. Justice, mon ami, is a complex thing. Mrs. Dawes will stand trial for murder as she must. Dr. Faraday will face the consequences of his academic dishonesty, but he will also have the opportunity to rebuild his career on a foundation of truth. And Professor Thistlewick, though he cannot see it, has finally achieved the justice he sought for his son. He placed the last book in its proper position and surveyed his handiwork with satisfaction. Voila! Order and method. Hastings. In books, as in life, everything must be in its proper place. The truth about Professor Thistlewick's death is now known, and those responsible have been held accountable. That perhaps is the best justice we can hope for in this imperfect world. As evening fell over London, I found myself grateful once again for my friendship with Hercule. His remarkable mind had unraveled the complex web of deception surrounding Professor Thistlewick's death, bringing light to dark corners and ensuring that justice, however delayed, was finally served. The case of the double life of Professor Thistlewick had reached its conclusion, and with it another chapter in the remarkable career of the world's greatest detective.